Another big part of the mid 1800s are a series of reform movements, of which women are a driving factor, right? So it's not that any of these reform movements are solely based on women, but women are active with them and they care about them. And they influence men to care about them, and they attend meetings where there's men and women. So these reform movements are a gateway for women to have political activity. Um, and so this is kind of where you see kind of this power of women coming in. And remember, women, it was appropriate for women to express themselves through these reform movements, because the perception was that these women were caring for society at large, just as they would care for their families. And so this is why this is such a powerful tool for women to kind of begin to lay the groundwork for them having rights, having opportunities, and you begin to see these changes. And this will happen again in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where women become engaged in reform movements as a way of really kind of driving home that they should have the right to vote. Now, in the mid 1800s, they don't get the right to vote, but you do start to see them really kind of taking action. Right. So the first of these is the idea of temperance. This is not prohibition the way we think of prohibition circa 1920s, where it was completely outlawed. This comes before prohibition, right? And it had been around for about 100 years before the 18th Amendment takes place. And it really just argues for abstinence, right? And sobriety, that you should not drink, or if you do drink, it should be very, very little. And they point to the social problems of poverty, abuse, neglect. And again, they say that, the blame is on alcohol for doing this. Now, I would argue that really what you have happening is the market economy and the factory system creating poverty and frustration, and poverty and frustration and new immigrants and people under stress are going to try to escape that through whatever means necessary, in this case, alcohol. And then that produces a variety of effects. So it's kind of a tangle, right? It's a fur ball of not just issues about social problems, but also issues about kind of the market economy. The issue with temperance people is that they blame it all on alcohol. If we just fix the alcohol problem, then all these other social ills will go away, and then we can begin, people won't spend as much money on alcohol, they won't be as poor, all that kind of stuff. So this is kind of what you see coming out of the temperance movement. It tends to have a little bit of an anti-immigrant kind of status, sometimes pretty subtly, sometimes very explicitly, largely because, the Irish were stereotypically drinkers, Germans were stereotypically drinkers. The idea was that these people are coming in and they're bringing their alcohol consumption with them, and so that we need to change these immigrants to force them to assimilate into the good Protestant Christian values of America. That's kind of what you see happening there. So a little bit anti-immigrant. It also has very much kind of a middle class control factor, right? That the middle class are trying to tell everybody what to do. We know what's best for you, all that kind of stuff. So there's some paternalism that's going on there that is problematic. And fundamentally, one of the biggest critiques of the temperance movement is that it kind of promotes sobriety as a benefit to the factory system. In other words, shouldn't factory owners want to promote temperance because you don't want your workers coming in hungover or missing work because they're drunk or whatever? And a lot of this is going to take on the stance of protecting women. Think of the women and children, right? Women and children are so vulnerable, and the men drink, and then they come home and beat their wives, or they force their wives to have sex, and then they have too many kids that they can't afford to feed. And so this idea is that if we protect the women from alcoholic men, that the saloon and alcohol threatens women, that this is kind of the way in which we can kind of protect the family, right? And the idea was it gets shrouded in this, focus on the family and this idea of democracy, that people shouldn't drink when they go vote, right? And that it's American to be sober and hardworking and all this kind of stuff. Now, of course, the problem with this is it ignores the fact that in most election days, it's generally a great big party, right? So one of the things that comes out of Andrew Jackson's term as president is that they're frequently having these big parties every time there's an election day. So yeah, not exactly, kind of a little bit of an exaggeration there. But this is the origin of the temperance movement. And the American Temperance Society, of course, it's one of several organizations that form that promote temperance and sobriety. But it becomes certainly one of the most vocal, puts a lot of pressure on politicians, and really kind of crosses party lines. It's not any one party over the other. What we'll see after the Civil War, that will tend to be the Republican Party more so than it is the Democratic Party. But you get the general idea, kind of what I'm talking about. I'm trying to make the glare go out of my glasses. Anyways, and so you kind of see how temperance kind of plays into this kind of immigration system with all the immigrants coming in, with the factory system, as well as women, like this idea that it benefits women, that women don't have to worry about being forced to have sex, or husbands that beat them, or husbands that spend the food money to go buy alcohol. So it's definitely couched in those terms. The next one is education. This is the idea that it helps to have factory workers that can read and write and do basic math, right? That the factory system works better when people have essential literacy. And so that basically we need to promote public education. The most famous of these is a guy by the name of Horace Mann. So if I have anybody going into teaching as a career, you'll somewhere along the lines hear about Horace Mann. It kind of begins in Massachusetts, and kind of promotes this idea that you take tax dollars, local or state tax dollars, and you create a school system. Now, of course, the issue is that there's a lot of places that question the funding of this. Is this the responsibility of society? Should society be doing this? And so it's kind of a slow process. In other words, it starts in the early 1800s in Massachusetts, and then you see it popping up in a variety of communities. So it takes probably about 80, 90 years for it to kind of gain some momentum. But by the early 20th century, we'll begin to see public education as being something that people are kind of promoting, especially as the debate comes in about child labor and whether children should be at school or whether they should be working. So this is kind of, but you do have, this is where it starts, the question that a good factory worker has basic literacy, and that it's better to teach people essential skills, that it makes for a more democratic system if people can read and learn things for themselves and think for themselves. The next one that's kind of a big deal is the asylum system. Now, the asylum system could imply like a mental health asylum. It could imply an orphanage. It could imply just a general hospital for people who were sick with like tuberculosis or something. To some extent, it can include jails. So the idea, or what they would call back then penitentiaries, right? Which we call them penitentiaries too, but it had a different meaning back then, because in the asylum movement, it was focusing on whether you're mentally ill, whether you're sick, whether you're an orphan, or whether you've committed a crime. The idea was reintegrating you back into society. If you're in a penitentiary, you're going to be penitent. If you're in an asylum, where we have to calm you down and kind of retrain you to fit back in with normal society. And so it really kind of, this movement represents a transition, right? It used to be, prior to the asylum movement of the 1830s and 40s, that if you had somebody who was mentally ill, it was out of sight, out of mind. You chained them up somewhere. Of course, sometimes people who were not truly mentally ill, could sometimes be locked up, or sometimes it would be a question of, somebody with kind of a temporary depression or PTSD or, postpartum or something like that. And if they had people in their family that either overreacted or reacted, had the wrong people giving them advice, or if they were just really awful people and wanted to use this to their advantage, they would send them off, right? And they would be kept in kind of these awful, horrible conditions, chained to walls, all this kind of stuff. In fact, one of the primary documents I shared is from Dorothea Dix, right, talking about some of what she saw. And so again, it's kind of this idea of out of sight, out of mind. But Dorothea Dix will come in. Jeremy Bentham is another one that come in and say, no, we're doing this all wrong. Like the idea that we shut people out of society it is wrong, because then they never learn to become good, responsible members of society. And that this is the whole goal, right? So we're going to reform these people. We're going to reintegrate them. We're going to train them. We're going to kind of resolve their issues. A lot of this has to do with regimentation and control, that we need a lot of structure in the system. So for mental hospitals, it would be like a very strict schedule. Like, you have to eat at this time, you have to shower at this time, you have to go to the bathroom at this time you do this kind of class, at this time you do that kind of class. And then it's all about kind of creating this calming environment, right? This is where things like the straitjacket come in, to keep people from flailing about, to keep them, regimented and tightly controlled. And some pretty other awful ones, putting them in a box to keep them still and shut them out from stimulus, which sounds pretty awful. So lots of kind of really horrible things that happen there. In the mental asylums, orphanages, kind of the same way. They began to transition the orphanages from just kind of locking the kids up and throwing them food, kind of circa, Charles Dickens, but to doing something that involves education and training. Jails were about being penitent, kind of doing constructive work in order to kind of reform yourself, to reflect on your actions, to improve what you're doing. So very different approach to people that are on the outside, that are on the margins of society, which I think is kind of an interesting kind of insight into what's happening with these reform movements. Again, women are trying to make the society whole again, make it healthy. The idea is that the market economy has fractured society and we have to try to repair it. But of course, like I mentioned here, in some cases, it's just people who are not conformists, right? People who want to march to their own beat, or, you take somebody who's just a little bit off or different, and they might say, oh, well, you're clearly mentally ill, right? And instead of trying to coach somebody through it or trying to help them through it, and then, not locking them away, people would still end up being sent to an asylum. So not a perfect system. It is somewhat of an improvement. And there's a whole interesting analysis about kind of the penitentiary system and how we go from jails, right, and dungeons, to penitentiaries, to kind of back to jails and dungeons, right? And so when are we going to come back around to this idea of penitentiary, that you're penitent and you reform and you reintegrate into society? So this is kind of an interesting tension that we see today. So anyways, that's kind of the foundation of the reform movements. In addition to the reform movements, you have abolition. Early abolition starts in the early 1800s. This has to do with an awareness that slavery was a wrong. It was something we needed to fix. But a lot of the early abolitionists weren't really sure how to do it. Early on, as before the cotton gin and the cotton economy really takes off, there's kind of this assumption that it'll kind of fade away, that if we just keep it from going crazy, let's focus on gradual emancipation for people. This is why you have easing of manumission laws, that kind of thing. Ultimately, they come up with this idea of the American Colonization Society, which is, we'll send African Americans back to Africa. That'll fix everything. And of course, that's not particularly when you consider that there were African Americans that came over in 1619, you can see why in the early 1800s people would be like, yeah, no, I don't really want to go back to Africa. I don't know anything about that place, right? So not a perfect system, but that is kind of the idea of early abolition. And it's not really about trying to establish equality. It's really about this concern about the morality and spirituality of slavery, and or does the slave system promote an unfair economic advantage for slave owners? In other words, do we deny opportunity to poor individual whites or middle-class individual whites because they don't have access to slaves? And if they can't do that, then they're trapped in the market economy and they can't move west. They can't go get their own opportunity. And so this is kind of where you start to see some of the early ideas about ending slavery. Then you also have the idea of radical abolition. This is largely started by people like William Lloyd Garrison. The Grimke sisters are a big part of this. Radical abolition basically says it's immoral. We have to have immediate emancipation. That colonization is also wrong because we've brought these people over here. This is just something we have to deal with, and kind of argue that our democracy, the idea of all men are created equal, actually means something, and that the system of slavery with its exploitation and rape of Black women and it's ripping apart of families is a violation of the core kind of Christian values of the family. The American Anti-Slavery Society is the first one of these, and it starts out pretty small, but over the 20, 25 years it's around, it gains momentum and gains size, right? And you have a lot of women that are involved in abolition, particularly Northern women and Quaker women, largely because, first off, this idea about equality, this idea about rights that should be included for other people, really resonates with women. And so they feel particularly sympathetic to that. They also feel very kind of passionate about what's happening to African American women, what's happening to their families, what's happening to their children, and the rape. I mean, this is the secret everybody knows, but nobody talks about. Everybody knows that this is what's happening. They just try to pretend like they don't know, right? And so this radicalism, as we move into the 1850s, it becomes much more attractive because the Southerners are so arrogant, they're so full of themselves, they're so obstructionist, right? And it creates a lot of frustration. And then you put this on top of the fact that places like Great Britain have outlawed slavery. Of course, they didn't have to worry about it because Americans had slavery, but that's a whole nother story. So, there's kind of this idea that it becomes something that's more legitimized, right? And again, very, very frustrated. There's an economic component to abolition, which is that Western opportunities need to be open to everyone, and that slave owners would have an unfair advantage to that. And some of the reason why radical abolition takes hold too is because you have more voters, right? You have more ordinary, less property owning men, and those men are going to be particularly sensitive to the economic argument, right? So the idea of abolition kind of gains momentum, begins to kind of grow from that kind of early, like we need to gradually emancipate to no, we need to do it now, right? Now the main goals of abolition could vary from kind of a more quiet, kind of what we call moral suasion, which is the idea that you work within existing systems, existing churches, existing political institutions, the press, you kind of exert this kind of moral conviction, we need to change this, to action, which is we have to absolutely tear down the system, that anything that supports slavery needs to be done away with, right? It's much more radical, much more activist based. What will happen is that the crisis of the 1850s that I talked about last week, that will ultimately lead to this idea that suasion's not effective, right? That you can't talk to these people, that they're so determined to keep slavery around that they won't listen, right? And then, of course, one of the tensions that exists there is women's rights. We have the Declaration of Sentiments, which I'll talk about here in a bit, and that is going to kind of threaten to rip apart the abolitionists because you've got some men that are like, that is a little too far, like we need to, ending slavery is fine, I'm not sure about giving voting rights to all these other people, including blacks, right? So there's some tension there between the immorality of slavery and kind of losing your privilege, right? So there's kind of a tension of privilege versus, morality going on there. And so that kind of takes a back seat, right? In large part because Uncle Tom's Cabin begins to push this to the top of the list, as well as many other abolitionists. I kind of put a list of Black abolitionists here. And I shared a video clip of an actress giving Sojourner Truth's speech. Just gives you chills listening to it. Her talking about, ain't I a woman? Shouldn't I have the same rights? Frederick Douglass, if you watch the PBS Abolitionist series, they do a really good job talking about Frederick Douglass and his kind of complex life. He's a key person. Harriet Tubman, of course, that works on the Underground Railroad and brings a lot of free people. She's, of course, pretty important as well. And then I put on here David Walker. You'll see in the American Yop Reader, there's a selection from David Walker, who writes his appeal to the colored people of the world. And he's got a really interesting attack on this idea of colonization. He writes this in the 1830s as the African Colonization Society is trying to kind of push that this is the answer. And he's essentially saying, you know what, this country was built with the blood, sweat, and tears of my people. We are this country, and you can't send us back. Right. So I encourage you to go to the American Young Reader and read David Walker. Just really an amazing speech, and really kind of gives you a different perspective on African American kind of attitudes towards ending slavery. They want it to end, but they don't want to end slavery and just accept the crumbs off of somebody's plate. They want to be a part of this society, and this is a theme that happens over and over and over in America, which is that people of color want to be a part of the larger society, and people with white privilege try to keep them out. And then if you intersection that with the role of women, and then you again create a whole interesting tension between white women and black women, and how that kind of plays out. So anyway, so I wanted to kind of share that with you, just to kind of call your attention specifically to who David Walker was. And the last thing I'll talk about is kind of the resistance to abolition. So beginning in the 1830s, you have a gag rule that prevents any petition or legislation about slavery from being heard on the House floor. They won't even talk about it, right? You can't bring a bill up or anything like that. And so basically it shuts down the conversation about slavery. You won't have any conversation about slavery until you get to 1850, when we're trying to figure out what to do with all this land from the Mexican-American War. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the tension with Andrew Jackson and the economic crisis of the 1830s and the Whigs and the Democrat-Republicans, so forth and so on. And there's lots of concession to Southerners. And so really the gag rule is kind of a low point in congressional history. So just, at least we can take comfort that things have been bad before and they got better. So hopefully things are kind of not great now. Hopefully things will get better, right? We can hope. You also have issues of censorship, right? Particularly in the South. So when you have women like the Grimke sisters writing their appeal to Southern women, they seize that mail. They don't deliver it. Interfere with the U.S. mail, basically. And you also have violence against printing presses, particularly if you're on a border state or if you're in a city with a lot of kind of economic stress. So racial tensions are heightened because you've got lots of job competition. So anti-slavery papers, of course, would be the first targeted there. Black and female participation with the Seneca Falls Convention also add to this idea that we don't have to take these critiques seriously. And so again, you've got this rapidly changing world, right? This market economy, what is our place in it? You've got this issue of slavery. We've got a growing awareness of spirituality and repentance and action and reform, and this recognition of people as human beings and as a part of society. And yet we've got the existence of slavery. How do we handle that? How do we handle a globalized economy where places demand our cotton, where we want more land, right? So lots of things are changing that are causing this kind of tension over abolition. And then this kind of resistance to, whoa, that's too much change. We can't handle that just yet. So this really a lot of give and take. And again, women are interwoven in this because women are they're involved in the abolition movement. Whether, they're, Harriet Tubman or whether they're the Grimke sisters, or even to a different extent, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was an abolitionist as well. So abolition is something that women are very much engaged in, just like they're engaged with other reform efforts. So I'll stop here, and then the next section will actually talk about women's rights.